All right, welcome back. In this part of our series, we're diving deep into the ideological engines that really drove the world toward war. We're talking about the rise of these incredibly aggressive, expansionist states, Germany, Italy, and Japan. You see, these regimes didn't just accidentally stumble into a global conflict. In many ways, they were built for it. So let's break down how.
And this right here, this quote gets to the very heart of what we're talking about. I mean, just think about that for a second. What happens when a country decides it doesn't just want your obedience, but it wants to own your entire being? It's a complete rewiring of society, where an individual person has zero value outside of what they can do for the nation. This belief, this core idea, is what unleashed the kind of fanaticism that would set the world on fire.
So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll put the ideologies of Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan side by side to see how they were similar and how they were different. Then we're going to define the specific names they gave to their plans for conquest, Spazio Vitale and Lebensraum. And maybe most importantly, we're going to look at how they used the law itself as a weapon to tear down democracy from the inside.
Okay, so let's start with this big word, totalitarian. What does it actually mean? It's important to draw a really clear line here.
The biggest difference really comes down to ambition. See, a regular authoritarian dictator, they want you to shut up and do what you're told. They want to control the government. But a totalitarian leader, oh, they want so much more. They want to control what you think, what you believe, who you are. They're not just trying to run the country. They're trying to control reality itself, making every single part of your life, public and private, serve the goals of the state. And our first stop is Italy, which was really the original blueprint for this kind of state. Benito Mussolini and his fascist party, they didn't just invent a new political system, they were trying to create a whole new way of life that was built on one single idea, the absolute supremacy of the state.
At the heart of Mussolini's foreign policy was this concept called Spazio Vitale, or vital space. Now, this wasn't just some practical plan to get more resources. No, it was this grand, almost mystical idea that Italy had a divine right, a destiny even, to conquer the Mediterranean and North Africa and build a brand new Roman Empire. It was all about bringing back a glorious past.
And you can see on this timeline just how quickly that ideology turned into action. Once Mussolini had a firm grip on power, he put his theory into practice. The invasion of Abyssinia in 1935 was just unbelievably brutal. A modern army using things like chemical weapons against a country with spears and old rifles. The world was horrified, sure. The League of Nations slapped on some totally useless sanctions. And Italy's response? They just walked out of the League, basically proving that international law meant nothing if you had enough guns.
Now let's shift over to Germany, where this idea gets twisted into something even more dangerous. While Italian fascism was all about the glory of the state, Nazi Germany injected a much more sinister and radical element into the mix, the idea of race. Hitler, brilliantly and terrifyingly, fused the national anger over the Treaty of Versailles with a bizarre, pseudo-scientific theory of racial supremacy.
The absolute cornerstone of Nazi ideology was Lebensraum, living space. And we have to be clear, this was way beyond Italy's Spazio Vitale. This was an openly genocidal idea. It stated, flat out, that the German master race had the right to conquer Eastern Europe and that the Slavic and Jewish people who already lived there would have to be either enslaved, expelled, or just straight up exterminated to make room.
So how on earth did Hitler get the power to even attempt something so monstrous? Well, the most shocking part is that it wasn't a violent military coup. He used the democratic system to destroy it. And the speed of it is just breathtaking. In literally 2 months, Germany went from a struggling democracy to an absolute dictatorship. Hitler gets appointed chancellor, the Reichstag building conveniently burns down, he uses that as an excuse to suspend all civil rights, and that sets the stage for the final killer blow.
And that blow was the Enabling Act. You could call it a legal revolution. It basically gave Hitler and his cabinet the power to pass any law they wanted, for any reason, without the approval of Parliament, even if it completely violated the Constitution. Just let that sink in. The German Parliament essentially voted to make itself irrelevant. It was the moment German democracy voted itself out of existence.
Okay, for our third and final regime, Imperial Japan, the journey was different. In Japan, this slide into totalitarianism wasn't really led by one all-powerful, charismatic figure like Hitler or Mussolini. Instead, it was driven by an increasingly extreme and powerful military. You see, in Japan, the real power wasn't with the elected officials in Tokyo. Not really. It was with the generals and the admirals. They looked at things like democracy, personal freedom, and international treaties as weak, corrupting Western ideas. They felt these ideas were fundamentally un-Japanese and were holding the nation back from its true destiny.
So what was pushing them in this direction? Well, it was like a perfect storm of pressures. Japan was a modern industrial nation, but it had almost no natural resources of its own. No oil, no rubber, no iron. Then the Great Depression hits and absolutely devastates its economy, which depended on exports. This feeling of economic desperation poured gasoline on an already burning fire of ultra-nationalism, especially in the army, where they believed Japan's only path to survival was to conquer a resource-rich empire in Asia.
And if you want one event that shows you who was really in charge, this is it. In 1931, the Japanese army stationed in Manchuria just went ahead and launched a full-scale invasion all on its own. They didn't ask for permission from the government back in Tokyo. The civilian government was horrified and completely powerless to stop them. That was the moment it became crystal clear that the military, not the politicians, was calling the shots on Japan's foreign policy.
All right, let's take a quick pause here and see what we've learned. First question, what was that key difference between authoritarianism and totalitarianism? Right? An authoritarian regime wants to control your actions, but a totalitarian one wants to control your thoughts. It wants total control of society.
Okay, next one. Do you remember the name of that critical piece of legislation, the law that effectively handed Hitler absolute power in March 1933? That was, of course, the Enabling Act.
And finally, which one of our three examples took that unique path to power, where it was military factions, not a single all-powerful leader, driving the country toward war? Yep, that was Imperial Japan.
Now, before the main event of World War II even started, there was a horrifying preview of what was to come. The Spanish Civil War is often treated like a separate conflict, but it was absolutely essential. It was a live-fire testing ground for the next World War.
Spain essentially became a dress rehearsal for World War II. It was a classic proxy war. On one side, you had the fascists, back with troops and weapons from Germany and Italy. On the other, you had the Spanish Republic, backed by the Soviet Union. All the big ideological forces that were about to tear Europe apart were fighting it out on Spanish soil.
But it was also a military laboratory. Germany's Air Force sent its Condor Legion to Spain to perfect the tactics that would later be known as Blitzkrieg, these lightning-fast, coordinated attacks between planes and tanks. They tested out new weapons, like the terrifying Stuka dive bomber. And, chillingly, it's where they perfected the tactic of terror bombing, deliberately attacking cities and civilians just to break a population's will to fight. What they did to the town of Guernica was a taste of what was coming for the rest of Europe.
So, after all that, let's put it all together. Let's look at these three architects of the war, side by side.
This chart really lays it all out pretty clearly. You can see how their core motivations were a bit different. Germany's was all about race, Italy's was about national glory, and Japan's was driven by a desperate need for resources. But look at the similarities. Every single one of them saw democracy as pathetic, weak, and decadent. Each had a very specific shopping list of territories they planned to conquer, and all three shared the fundamental belief that war wasn't just an option. It was a glorious necessity for their nation to achieve its destiny.
So these regimes weren't hiding their intentions. They were spelling them out for the whole world to see. The massive, looming question was, how would the democracies of the world respond to this rising storm of aggression? And that's exactly what we'll get into in Part 4, as we look at the catastrophic failure of diplomacy and the policy of appeasement. Thanks for joining me for this one, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next.